Right. So welcome back, everybody. So this panel focused on slavery inheritance and slave trading widows. So a community of people here who are united by several different elements. So I'm going to sort of briefly talk about each of the papers. And I know that for some of you don't read Portuguese, so I'm going to try to talk about and somewhat summarize what our Lusophone authors also incorporate. And my Portuguese is okay. I married into a Brazilian family and I kind of got the hang of it, but it's still a bit flimsy. So I may have missed a few things. And there's one or two interesting terms that I couldn't find any explanation for whatsoever. So I'll come back to those. So in Teska and Roberts, we have the starting point of the linkage between property and family via marriage, right? So we've seen already, this is a recurring theme in the previous two panels. The Leverett cases that Roberts and Teska talk about in the Sudan emerged from a court case, from a set of court records from a window in time. So it's a very important window because Richard has been writing about this set of court cases in different ways for some time. And that window is a very important moment for external and internal forces. Externally, the Europeans are arriving and transforming the legal system, but internally, women are responding to the opportunities and challenges of these new transformations wrought by colonialism. And so we see in this collection of 100 or so Leverett cases, we see a set of struggles over the transfer of property, the expectation and the transfer of wives, and then we can start to ask questions. What does it mean for a widow? When their husband dies? What actually unfolds? From, I think for some of you who took the time to read Betty Potash, or if you read Joanna Davidson's article that came out this summer, we often begin with this moment that, widowhood is this tragic moment, right? It's often a sudden moment. It's very tragic and people are dealing with grief. And yet at the same time, all these terrible things are also unfolding in some of these cases, right? People are being stripped of their inheritance. They're being kicked out of their homes. If you look at news stories, you'll see those in many parts of Africa, kicked out of their homes, struggles over children. And we see these going on in this set of cluster of studies. But what we also can tell from these cluster of cases is just how intrinsic bride wealth is in both constructing and maintaining family units. So bride wealth restricts how widows are able to remarry, and the normative tendency is towards liberating marriage, right? So what we can see from these is that because we had no to talk about these 100 or so cases, but also set them against all the cases that don't come to court, right? All the disputes that are resolved normatively. And so what we can see from the number of women and also the number of family members who are bringing these cases to these French-created courts is that the normative bend is towards liberatic marriage. And Roberts and Teska asks a variety of questions about why might it be? Could it be, as Richard has previously found, tied to the agricultural cycle? Could it be about controlling labor in the context of labor scarcity in particular moments in time? And what can we do when we and how do we make sense of what they describe in the paper as the hardening of custom that takes place as these different external forces are visited on this territory? So the abolition of slavery, the creation of these particular courts, and the creation of a particular idea, introduced French idea of politique des races, which cements a particular version of a patriarchal standard. What is particularly interesting, and what I wanted to hear more about, is this tension between customary and Islamic. So often in the cases that I look at, those two are the same, one and the same. Often the Islamic tradition, quote unquote, is the thing that the woman is fleeing, the one that is the normative framework against which they're fleeing. But here we see these two things that are quite distinct. I mean, in fact, Islamic practices are portrayed as opposing particular forms of coercion, opposing particular forms of property disinheritance, and so forth. So I'll come back to that if I have a bit more time, but I want to move on now to Domingues. In Domingues' paper, we see this cluster. I'm just fascinated, but first of all, Daniel, how you found this little cluster of cases. So we only have a small cluster of cases, but they are rich, and I'm just desperate to know how to make sense of them. Right, so we have a group of women living in a particular, well, we have the bigger picture is women in towns and cities on the Mozambique coast in the epoch, which is the abolition of the slave trade, right? So we have the epoch, slavery is ending, again, like in the previous story, slavery is ending, and again, we need to go back to that moment. Richard and Susan Myers wrote a really important book about this transitional period, what happens when slavery ends. And here we see an example of what happens when slavery is ending. So the Portuguese are preparing for the end of slavery, and the way they do it is by reifying slavery, right? They're like, let's write down the names of all the slaves. Let's try to document all the slaves as a preparation for the abolition of slavery. It's a fascinating moment. It's almost the kind of thing that you imagine the British doing in Jamaica as they're imagining how much money they're going to get for the compensation for the slaves they're going to lose, right? So there's this preparatory stage, and you see women doing the same thing as men, right? They're registering their slaves. They don't know what's going to come down the pipeline. I don't think there's any monetary compensation, right, Daniel? But certainly there is this sort of preparatory stage which gives rise to this set of data. And in one particular town, we have Inhambane, we have 11 widowed women who own, one of them owns 19 slaves. And there are interesting little blips in their slave owning, the preponderance of owning women. So we have slave mistresses, masters or mistresses, and we have this group of people who are describing their different types of slaves, and then of course in continuing his earlier interests, Daniel also talks about different types of ethnicities of these slaves, like where might they have come from that they have ended up in this particular southern Mozambican town. What I want to know about more is how, well, first of all, how do we contextualize? Because I think you could write a really interesting story about these 3 widowed women in this small town, but how do we turn that into a bigger picture? And I think the answer really lies in looking at what Mariana and Vanicléia and others are doing to see what's happening, not necessarily exactly the same time, but in a similar sort of socioeconomic and cultural context. Then the second context really is what I already alluded to, which is this end of slavery transition moment. This is unlike all the other stories in the end of slavery book, though. I think Richard will agree, right? We don't have, I can't think of a case where people are being prepared for the end of slavery by documenting all their slaves in preparation for something that maybe doesn't quite come to pass. So I think I want to know more about what we think these communities were trying to do, and particularly what women were trying to do in documenting. There is like Mariana's paper, there is a little bit of trying to be Portuguese, trying to demonstrate their civilization, their notoriety as women of status, but I think there's more to it than that. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Santos' paper, and this focuses on Christina Perez. And for those of you who don't read Portuguese, Christina Perez is part of a lineage of commercial agents in Cacheu, in Portuguese Bissau, and she's taken before the Lisbon Inquisition in 1665. And it's from these fascinating Inquisition records that we get this story of this remarkable woman. Again, like the previous panel, we have a sort of certain serial polyandry, and we have this accumulation of wealth and property. that prepares the stage for a resistance to colonial overtures. So Perez is baptized in her own home. She doesn't learn to read or write. She's not necessarily, doesn't begin as a child of status, but she rises to an individual of status over the course of time through her father's success as a merchant and her father's network of merchants, but also through her own successful marriages. And by those successful marriages, she accumulates not only her husband's property, but also that of her parents. And then, I think this is the really important thing, and I wanted to hear more about this, is her father's client list, right? So we get her father's client list that really enables her to deepen her networks. And so in the records before the tribunal, I reluctantly call it a tribunal, but let's maintain this legal historical fiction. Before the auto de fe, before the Inquisition, she talks about all the black people that she talks to, right? So she, unlike most other merchants, is willing to trade with the fat ones, the skinny ones, the dark ones, the mixed ones, the people of different groups. Like, she is promiscuous in her merchant activities. And it's because of that that she is, of course, wealthy. It's because of that that she is able to have this economic position. It's because of that that people are jealous of her. So the sort of the sub-story of this is that the real reason for the Inquisition is probably to expropriate her from her wealth and her opportunity, but doesn't quite go as planned. And then the successful revolt, if you like, that manages to resist these attempts by Portuguese external authorities to control her, is that she's able to draw on this massive network, not only of traders and merchants in the forest that she's been part of, but also just her allies and the people who maybe haven't been slaves, and maybe even her slaves. Now, interestingly, some of her slaves testify against her, but we can imagine that most of those were probably done under the pain of torture or in the context of torture, right? And so we have this fascinating story of an attempt to expropriate. And so I want to learn more about that. I want to talk about expropriating widows, because that, in fact, is one of the, we didn't talk about this at the very beginning, but when I first started thinking about a widowhood project, I started reading stories if you just go into Google News and type in widows Africa, all the stories from Ghana and Nigeria about people being kicked out of their homes and stripped of their property, are the sort of things that you can read. And I started thinking about that. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about that. And then, of course, toward the end, we get a second story. And I think that's important because we have the story of Bibiana Vaz Gomez, and that's important so that we don't think of this just as a single story, but I think there's enough for a really rich microhistory. We don't necessarily need that second story for this to be a fascinating narration. So I would suggest that perhaps maybe that we either try to tell the story of these two people simultaneously, or we just tell the story of one rather than sort of tack on the end. But it does speak to the bigger context, which is that these are lived specific local events, creating specific types of subjectivities, and amazingly accessible biographies, right? So from these Inquisition records, we have this whole world comes to life. And I particularly enjoy the narrative of the town, how you explain between the Via Quente and the Via Fria, the cold part of town, the hot part of town, if you like, rudely translated, where the networks are created and the different constituencies mobilized. And then finally, and I don't know, finally we turn to the Signaris Paper by Farias. Now, for many of us, Signares are a familiar story. We've heard about these important women before. Signares and Nhares, maybe originating from a Portuguese or Spanish term about women of status. But here we start to think about them anew through their widowhood. And I think that's a really interesting reapproach to Signares. So we have a set of stories from different people that emerge out of notarial records, wills, sales records, powers of attorney, the types of documents that, that proliferate in the world of civil law, not necessarily common law, and are really now being given the type of attention that they deserve. Mariana and others before her are realizing that these types of records not only situate a person, but they situate a person within a network of individuals and a network of traders. So again, the Signares are a group of women, that we have previously heard about in different contexts. But here we see them documenting themselves through their inheritance, right? We see them narrating who they are as women of status through their accumulation toward the end of their lives. And so rather than focusing on them as sexual objects or objects of sexual service, instead we're talking about them as sorry, that's Dilma requesting a walk. My dog is called Juma. Juma Rousseff Silva Lawrance is her full name, in case you're wondering.
Juma like in Friday?
Yeah. No, Juma like the president of Brazil. So, so Juma is going off again. She's going to walk herself, I think. So what we see, these Signares, we read their wills to ascertain their wealth, right? So they resisted abolition in this, and the period that we're looking at here is very important because, again, like Daniel's paper, they are in the context of the destabilization and the same paper as Wallace and Richard. These are in the period where slavery is being dismantled and they're struggling to hold on to their property. And they're making the claim that without slave labor, they will fail, right? They're not able to do the things that men can do. They're not able to be the people that they are without slave labor. And this is an interesting, almost Southern American argument about slavery that I've never seen in an African historical context. And I'm sure there are perhaps some examples from South Africa that might look similar to this. But I've certainly never seen historical records where exponents of slavery just point to how without slaves they would be nothing. So although we're unable to have comments from everybody in this panel, I do want to just sort of raise a couple of questions, sort of drawing these four papers together, which is to talk again about property and the relationship of slaves as property and slaves as property as a mechanism for creating status. So many of the wives in Richard's and Wallace's paper start out as slaves, right? They're slaves that have been captured in the context of the wars of the various jihadic conflicts and the anti-French conflicts that have been going on in the late 19th century. And by the time they seek freedom, they can't really prove that they're really wives or that they're just somehow servants, right? They're in this fuzzy status. And so their inability to access the freedoms promised by the French are, it resides partly in that fuzziness of status. And then we turn to Mozambique or to Portuguese Guinea or to Senegal, and we see how slaves become vehicles for property accumulation, but also intrinsic to the survival of widowhood as these individuals turn into widows at when suddenly somebody dies, when the sudden tragic event takes place. They document themselves, and they document themselves through their accumulation of enslaved peoples. So I'll stop there and let's see if we have some responses from some of the authors and comments from the audience.
We just want to go one by one.
Yeah, sure.
So we can get started then. Well, thank you, first of all, Benjamin, for all the comments. I wanted to start first with this tension between custom and Islamic law that you brought up in your initial comments. which is one of the sections in our paper that we focus on. And so these tensions between Islamic law or jurisprudence and custom are often overlooked in this literature, often because kind of the divide between African studies and Islamic studies doesn't allow for people to grasp both of those literatures at the same time. And so for this section, we're really kind of like Abbas's paper. We're looking at these discrepancies between norms and practices within the French colonial courts. And so in these courts, the French divided litigants between those of Muslim status and of non-Muslim status, and enforced different legal codes for each depending on those statuses. And so we looked at these categories in a few different types of disputes. So first of all, we had the levirate disputes, which are really the focus of our paper. And in Islamic law, there's no forced levirate, which comes into conflict with the Bamana ideal that there is a mandatory levirate when a man dies, his widow is forced to marry his next eldest brother. And so we often find in these disputes that widows are using their status as Muslims to try to resist levirate marriages, particularly in these families of mixed status, where we have some family members have converted to Islam, others have not yet converted. So this period we're examining from 1905 to 1912 is really an era of massive change, where there is conversion to Islam en masse. So we see a great deal of these conflicts within families of mixed status. And this not only, it isn't just limited to levirate matters, it also extends to conflicts over child custody, where Maliki fiqh, where the jurisprudence of the predominant Islamic legal school in this area says that women, widows, should retain custody of their children until they've reached puberty, generally. That norm is not always enforced in the courts, unlike the levirate disputes, which are often, it's acknowledged that Muslim women do not have to marry their brothers-in-law. But it also goes to these inheritance disputes that we see predominantly between sons of the deceased and their uncles, because under customary law, the totality of the property, the inheritance, will go to the brother-in-law, the lever, whereas in Maliki fiqh, that's not generally the case. Generally, it's divided more evenly between the children and the spouses of the deceased. So we see these conflicts between sons who have converted to Islam and their uncles who have not converted over who should retain the property, the inheritance. And of course, all of this happens during a time where, as Benjamin pointed out, this is the years following the French abolition of slavery. And so there are concerns over being able to maintain control over property, but then also over labor within the household, which includes both slaves and wives. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Richard.
Thank you, Wallace and Benjamin and everyone else. Sorry I came on late, but California time is just too demanding. But in any case, you know, one of the important things that Benjamin had raised at the beginning of his comments is the fact that what we see in many of these court cases are disputes that are taken before these formal institutions. And there are a whole variety of other mechanisms of solving problems that are not there. So it's a universe that's extremely limited. And as Wallace was just talking about in terms of the growing conversion to Islam that's happening during this period, we just don't have access to Qadi cases. We don't know where they are. And one of the things that Wallace will be doing when he goes into the field is to be looking for this body of source material. But nonetheless, what becomes interesting when you look at the nature of these 100-odd levirate cases is who are the plaintiffs and who are the defendants. And we break that down a little bit, and it becomes a really intriguing view that it's not just brothers, the levers, who are in court, but it's also the widows who are in court. And that becomes important too, because we want to be able to identify agency in this process. So the other crucially important part of this story is about how to protect wealth, and particularly in this moment where the largest body of wealth, slave labor in particular, is negotiating its departure or leaving. And so the questions there are that so many of these cases around widows, around households, are subsumed in different categories when in fact they do reveal these household tensions. So one of the things we tried to do in this paper, and as everyone else in this question about widows, is what are the household struggles really like? And what agency do the various actors have? And what resources do they bring to bear in their struggles? So let me turn this over to the rest of the
Great. Daniel?
Hi, well, thank you very much for your comments. Thank you everybody for attending the panel. Yes, if Mariana said she's new to this topic, if she's new, I don't know what I am. But I came across these references to the widows in Mozambique, and I said, you know what, there's this interesting panel that Ben and Emily are organizing. I think I'm gonna just submit a paper to that panel. But yeah, well, I also found it fascinating. The whole purpose of the registration was to gradually abolish slavery in the Portuguese Empire. And the Portuguese, they weren't sure about compensation. In 1858, they say that they will think about it, but then later on they decided not to, right? And they did so because they converted all slaves into freed people in 1869, in which, no, with the but with the proviso that everybody would still have to work for their masters for a period of almost 10 years. Right? And later on, they set a term limit to end that obligation. But the funny thing is that now everybody in theory became free, but not exactly free. They were still subject to tutelage, to the state, the Portuguese state then. Now, my research on the women and women, slave-owning women, and in the widows, in that context, I thought it was a major contribution because I don't think I've seen anything about it in Mozambique. We do have studies for Angola, we do have studies for Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, right, other areas of Africa, Senegal, right? But I don't recall seeing anything specifically about Mozambique. And when I consulted the dictionary of slave owners and slave traders compiled by José Capella, I mean, the vast majority of the entries are also men, right? Male slave owners and slave traders. So when I came across this reference to women, and not only the women who appear in the documentation, they appear with Portuguese names, but they also appear with Muslim names and what I think are Gujarati names. Right? They appear, in significant proportion. So something the average 30%, so a third of all slave owners in Mozambique were women, and a subset of them were widows. And in some places like Inhambane, which was a major slave trading port in Mozambique, their proportion is actually higher, larger, something around 40-45% of all slave owners. So that for me was very revealing and very important, and it matches with the findings that Mariana, Vanicléia, Vanessa, Hilary Jones, and other researchers are finding for other parts of Africa. Now, to contextualize their lives, paint a bigger picture. That would require more research, because what I would have to do is to cross-list these sources, these other contemporary records. Right? I'm a little skeptical whether we'll succeed, and that's probably because Jose Capella, he has this dictionary, and he doesn't list that many women. So I'm a little afraid that I might not succeed, but I will definitely try, and hopefully, if we find more information about the women and widows of Inhambane or Mozambique in general, I will move forward into contextualizing and painting a more detailed picture. Thank you.
Great. Vanicléia?
Good morning. Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I'd like to say thanks to Benjamin for your accurate reading and for your comments. And also thanks Emily and Benjamin for organizing this panel. And I'm so happy to share this panel with everyone, and especially with my Brazilian friends, Mariana and Danielle. And thanks to Mariana, I am here. She knows what I'm talking about. And about your questions, Benjamin, I will say that most information about Crispina are indirect information, right? I'm reading this document has 400 pages, right? And I worked a lot in this document, and I have one Excel sheet with 100 people. So I was connecting the information among them, and I have a very beautiful graphic about the network in this area. So what I know about her father and how she inherited his network. I think that one key, I have a key information that's about the snake. So many people accused her to have a snake, and this snake was in another place. It's at Bugando in Guinea, where she has 2 houses to operate her slave trade business. So, and her father also had business in this area. So I associated in my interpretation the idea that she inherited the snake that gave her prosperity, and it gave prosperity for her father. It is connected to this network, this large network that she had. She had business between Casamance River to Sierra Leone rivers. So, and it's the same area that her father and her mother were working when they were alive. Because when she was arrested, they were died. So, and the other question is about expropriating widows. So when I brought the case of Crispina or Bibiana Vaz, you are correct. I was trying to say that Crispina was not an exclusive case, right? I figured out another woman, very rich woman called Jane Vaz, that she was from Cacheu, and she had a merchant ship that she was going back to Gambia River in the beginning of the 17th century. So, but the case of Christina and Bibiana are different, especially when you think about how they were trying to expropriate their properties. Because in the case of Bibiana, the fight, no, it's not the fight, but she became known because the son of her husband, of his first marriage, was contesting the property that she inherited from her husband, right? So, and when he was contesting and he said, I want the slave, I want the captives, she sent the captives to the other property that she had 300 kilometers from Cacheu. And she said, okay, do you want the property? Take the slaves. But how the guy will have access to the slaves? Because she had the control of her business in the hinterland. So, but the case of Christina was different because Christina was fighting against the Portuguese authorities, right? Because she made no, I don't know who created the animosity, but the most important Portuguese and Cape Verdean authorities became her enemies. And when she fought with those authorities, they tried to take everything that she had. So in this document, the Inquisition document, they say that they confiscated all her property. But I don't believe that they did it. Because when she returned to Cacheu, she went to her house. But what was her property? She had captives, a lot of captives, a lot of households, a lot of relatives working for her. They can't take this kind of properties, right? So I think that the idea of expropriating in this case is important to understand how they try to take off the power of Christina in Cacheu. And what did you ask about Vila Fria and Vila Quente?
Oh, I didn't. That wasn't so much a question. That was just an observation. Yeah.
Okay, but I'd like to hear you all more than talk. I think that's important to hear what you can say.
Thank you, Vanicléia. I really liked your last comment. Maybe just think a little bit about how expropriating widows in the context of slavery really does change the dynamic. It is indeed much harder to expropriate, right? So whether it's like in Daniel's case, they're documenting all their slaves, or whether it's like in Wallace and Richard's case, where their status of wives or servants is ambiguous, in the context of where slavery is normative, the terrors of widowhood expropriation are more difficult, or they're certainly not the same that we've been talking about in other contexts. Let's hear what other people have to say. Other comments. Sarah has posted a comment in the chat. I don't know if you want to chime in, Sarah, or Rochaya?
I can speak for a second. I'm not going to quite give you the image that is happening right now, which is me hiding under covers in my couch. It's rather cold up here. But like, I have been thinking about this idea of enslavability and how it relates to status. And what this conference has made me think about is how widowhood can also be a claim to this status of not being enslavable in particular sites where a woman's status can be rather precarious, particularly after a partner becomes deceased. And I was just kind of making that comment that I'm seeing that across several of these examples within this panel, but then also in Mariana Candido's paper from the previous panel.
Mm-hmm. Other people? Anyone like to respond to that or make other comments? Rochaya?
Ben, I don't know if this is of any interest to Daniel de Silva about the absence of any material on women. Just a quick thought, I don't know if it would be helpful at all, but what about looking at the overall Portuguese presence around the Indian Ocean Rim, the slavery, that, or just the different, that imperial encounter. Maybe you can find something in the overall discussion, like in Harms, for example, wrote about the Indian Ocean slavery and abolition. So maybe there will be something there. The other thing is also, I think, connected to the idea of women and inheritance and so on in the same context. If you use the keyword concubines or Suria, S-U-R-I-A, probably that is going to also yield some insights. So I would just encourage that because of some readings I did around the Indian Ocean circularities, and it involved slavery, gender politics, concubinage, sex, and all of these issues. My other comment for Wallace, it is not just, I just want to reiterate what he was saying about religion, Islamic law, and custom, very much of a blurred boundary that we encounter over and over again. Later on, when I try to discuss my own paper, I struggled with it. To what extent can we understand these shifting ties? And in what context do some Islamic law or religious tenets became so vernacularized as custom and tradition? And that is all I had to say, but I enjoyed everybody and Santos and the Silva and Wallace and Roberts and everybody's contribution and your comments, Ben. Thank you.
Mariana?
I just want to go back to a conversation we are having earlier today about, I think it was Kat who posted this idea that people had to be legally married to be recognized as widows. And I don't think this is what is happening in Santos and in Vanicléia and Daniel. Sorry, I will go in the Brazilian way, called by the first name. Vanicléia and Daniel's paper, I don't think these are necessarily, I don't think these are unions recognized by like legal, that it happened. There was a paper to prove it, and yet there is a recognition that these are widows. Isn't it? Or did I understand it wrong? The impression that I have is that they were not married, and yet there was a recognition that these were widows after the husband died and they can inherit property, isn't it?
I do not have any kind of evidence that they have a formal marriage. I think that they use the customary law to marry. For example, in this document, I had indirect information about the union, right? One is about a priest complaining that the guy married with her slave, and the person did not pay. paid him to marry her, right? And he fought with the guy. They fought in the street because he did not pay, and he married her slave. And the other one is about Christina explaining that she did not make witchcraft because she was accused to make witchcraft to marry her second husband, because he was a wealthy guy. And so they said she made witchcraft to marry 2 times with 2 prominent merchants. So she said that she did not make, when she was defending herself, that she did not make witchcraft. She said, when he disposal me, I don't know how to say it in English, disposal is like when he slept with him. She said, when we slept the first time, he was sick already. But she did not use the word casar, marry, right? So in my interpretation, everyone married according to the customary laws.
Yes, thank you very much for your suggestions. I will look at that literature. I should say that no, there are historians who have worked on the history of women in Mozambique. Kathleen Sheldon, for example, Francesca Delish is another one. But most of them work on women workers, right, or slave women. Whereas my research is focused on slave-owning women. And we are aware that there were slave-owning women further north, the coast of East Africa. And I think actually most of the studies on the history of slavery and the slave trade focus more on that section of the African coast. But I will expand my geographic area of research to see if I can find additional references to supplement my own study. Thank you.
So I saw a question from Richard, and then I see a hand raised by Wesley. Richard, we'll hear from Richard first, and then Wesley, if you want to ask a question, please do so after Richard.
Sure. I just wanted to raise a question about the production of these registers that become so important. And one of the things we have to bear in mind is that the reach of the colonial officials who are actually doing this recording is so small. And so the flip side of that is it has to be in the interests of those people who are going to these officials to register their property or slaves. And I think that's a really crucially important thing, because it's a new way of making claims on things. And so we have to bear in mind that the world is much bigger than these registers, but it's a new way of making claims. We have to think about that in terms of the different ways in which people without power can use these new resources to enhance their claims on things.
Yes, definitely. Different from censuses, which the Portuguese also conducted at the time, the registers, the owners had to come to the registry with their slaves for inspection, right? Whereas in the census, Portuguese officials would go to the master's residence in order to, count everybody, right? So you're absolutely right. And the threat was that if they didn't present their slaves to the registry, they would lose their rights over their human ownership, right? So that was the threat. And the masters resisted, including the slave-owning women masters, right? The women masters, they resisted registration at first. So the Portuguese government had to insist and make a number of accommodations and impositions in order to have the master class to register their slaves.
Wesley, do you want to chime in? You have your hand raised. Maybe that's an error.
Can you hear me?
Hi there.
Hello, good evening. Yeah.
Hi, Wesley.
Hello everyone. I'm very pleased to see your faces. I see the face of Emily, Lawrence. I'm seeing these faces for the first time, and I find it this discussion so far very, very interesting. Having to have a global view, perspective of widowhood practices from around the world. Yeah, I'm going to speak particularly Nigeria.
So we're having a hard time hearing you, Wesley. Your sound is not great. But if you want to type your question in the chat function, that might be the best thing to do. I think perhaps the bandwidth is not strong enough.
Well, thank you very much.
So just
okay, yeah, it's not strong here.
Type.
Just type it in and I'll read it out. And we have a question. We have a question from Kate.
Yeah, it was just a small kind of methodological suggestion. I don't know how useful this could be, but I came across a couple of interesting articles recently from the Caribbean looking at women as beneficiaries of wills, sometimes as widows, but sometimes as kind of widows of concubinage relationships, which dealt obviously with the passing on of slave property in inverted commas. So I was thinking of Erin Trahey, who had an article in 2019 which made an argument about women and the inheritance of their slave property and then how they went on to bequeath that property, and also Marisa Fuentes, and there are others too, but those two just came to my mind whilst you were talking, if anybody might have an interest in kind of pursuing that comparatively with the Caribbean.
Would anyone like to respond to that?
Just want to say thank you for bringing this to our attention.
Other comments?
Can I add one quick comment? It might be obvious, but it continues to be interesting to me, which is that I'm still thinking about Kat's comments about juridical personhood and how this is it's going to be a through line in different ways. I think of all these panels, but it comes up in a different way on this panel because the question of enslavement and slavery is raised in a way that we don't see in some of the earlier panels. And so this different way of thinking about juridical personhood and rights and person and the layered elements of wives as property owners, widows as property owners is coming up, and I'm just struck by that. I don't have anything insightful to say. I'm flagging it. We'll be talking about it at the end of the day.
I've been thinking about this as well, and part of it is, you know, is which way power flows in this. You know, are women powerful through owning slaves and because they can own slaves, or is it the owning of slaves that renders them powerful? I'm not sure that, you know, I'm not sure how important a question it is, but it kind of, for me, the way that women kind of navigate juridical personhood through slave owning, that might be kind of a point upon which it turns.
Or even, yeah. Was that you, Benjamin?
Well,
or Daniel? Okay, sorry.
So yeah, well, in the case of the Portuguese Mozambique, I've seen records of slave owning women, you know, referring to their at the time they were supposed to be freed people, but they continue referring to them as slaves. And there are also records of African slave women who are trying to approach Portuguese authorities, accusing their mistresses of trying to sell them into the Indian Ocean traffic. You know, so the slave owning women, they were pretty, insistent in maintaining their power over their human property.
And also this triangulated element that Sarah's bringing up, which you see in the Teska and Roberts paper, which is women identifying themselves as widows in the court as a way of, maybe as a preventative measure, as a way of protecting oneself from being understood to be a slave. So.
Great. Well, I think we should pause now. We have a little 5-minute break until the next panel, right? So this is really quite a marathon of scholarship.
No, that's actually Sorry, Benjamin. We're going to have a 12 to 1 break.
Sorry, we have an hour
sorry.
break. Yay, which is not really lunchtime for me, but I'll have
No,
lunch
I'm
anyway.
sorry about the Eastern Standard Time dominance here. I apologize.
That's okay. I'm always happy to eat.
Okay. Dog walking break. That's right.
So we're going to resume in about 1 hour.
Yes.
And Emily's going to pause the recording. So you stay logged in because we're going to keep the same Zoom room open. And we will, I think we'll do a couple of things. We'll make sure that Wesley's paper is uploaded to the Dropbox. And we'll also, I think we're going to open a file for people to add citations, references to scholarship that pertains to widows, that we have a common bibliography.
Yeah, that's a good idea. All right, so everyone take a break, stretch, get some water, and come back in an hour.
Thank you, everybody. Vani, I thought of a title for your, Emily, you need to stop the recording.